Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. If you love slow, tender stories of women who are overlooked, underestimated, and quietly extraordinary, and the gentle unravelings that changed everything for them, then settle in and make yourself comfortable. And if this story brings you comfort, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Eleanor Vane was 27 years old and she had already been forgotten. She was the second daughter of Sir Edmund Vane of Wiltshire, a baronet whose debts had long outgrown his dignity. The summer she turned 26, her father sat across a solicitor's desk from Lord Ashworth's man of business, and the arrangement was settled in an afternoon. Eleanor's hand, her modest £1,200 dowry, and the Vane family's long-standing obligation cleared at a stroke. There was no courtship. There were letters, 3 of them, formal and brief, signed in a hand she did not yet know. There was a settlement she was not permitted to read in full, and then there was a grey Tuesday in February of 1823, when Eleanor climbed into a hired carriage at dawn with one trunk, and did not look back at the house where she had grown up. The road to Ashwell Park ran 3 miles through bare elms, their black branches pressed against a sky the colour of pewter. The iron-coloured fields stretched away on either side as though the land itself had agreed to give nothing away. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had not brought her father's apologies because none had been offered. She had decided some weeks prior that she would not weep, and she was not weeping now. She was thinking quietly and carefully about what a woman of 27 does when her future has already been decided without her. The house appeared at the end of the drive like a held breath. Dark stone, a long unsmiling facade with many windows, all shuttered. The chimneys were cold. It looked, she thought, like a house that had stopped expecting anyone to arrive. She had married Lord Ashworth the day before, in the church at Kelthorpe village, with a curate, a clerk, and no one else of consequence. Ashworth himself was perhaps 34, dark-haired, and he had the kind of face that had learned, very thoroughly, not to be read. He stood beside her at the altar with the particular stillness of a man who has rehearsed composure until it has become him. He spoke his vows in a voice as measured and unhurried as a man reading a legal document aloud, paragraph by paragraph, each clause properly discharged. He did not meet her eyes, not once, from the first word to the last. When the curate pronounced them married, Ashworth inclined his head, an acknowledgment or simply a habit of courtesy, she could not tell which. He handed her into the carriage afterward with correct and impersonal care. The great hall of Ashwell Park received her in silence. The flagstone floor ran its full length, pale grey and worn smooth by decades of use, and at the far end stood a fireplace, wide enough and deep enough to stable a horse inside it. It was cold. No fire had been laid. There were no flowers anywhere in the hall, only the smell of beeswax and old stone, a quiet, close scent that reminded Eleanor of empty churches. The portraits on the upper walls looked down with the collected indifference of people who had witnessed a great deal and been moved by very little. She stood in the centre of it all with her travelling cloak still fastened, and felt, very quietly, the full weight of what she had agreed to. Then a door at the far end of the hall opened, and a small woman in a dark dress came toward her with the measured step of someone who had kept a large house running through difficult years. She had sharp eyes, not unkind. She stopped before Eleanor and said, "The blue room is aired, my lady. I thought you might wish to rest before dinner." She said it simply, without ceremony, and without glancing past Eleanor's shoulder to Lord Ashworth as though awaiting his correction. Eleanor said, "Thank you. That is very kind." The woman, Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, as Eleanor would learn, nodded once and turned to lead the way. It was the first exchange of genuine human warmth Eleanor had been offered since the morning of her wedding, and she received it the way a cold traveller receives a candle, with quiet, careful gratitude and the faint hope that more light might yet follow. The blue room waited. The hall went still behind her. The frost came in the night. It pressed its ferns against the blue room's glass and held them there until morning. Pale and intricate and entirely indifferent to the woman on the other side, Eleanor lay in the dark before dawn and listened. A floorboard shifted in the passage, once and then again. Boots descended a stair with the quiet purpose of a man long accustomed to early hours, and to no one waiting up for him. The courtyard door opened below her window. A horse's hoofs struck cobblestone twice and then grew faint across the gravel drive and were gone into the grey. Ashworth had left before the house was awake. She lay for a while longer watching the frost dissolve as the light came up, slow and colourless, and she thought that a house which holds its breath this early in the morning must be long practised in the habit. She had been a wife for exactly 2 days. She had spoken to her husband in that time, for perhaps a quarter of an hour in total. No invitation to breakfast came. She had half expected one. A note slid under the door, some formal arrangement. Instead, a tray appeared. Mrs. Hale brought it herself, setting it down softly on the table by the window as though too firm a hand might wake something better left sleeping. There was tea, still hot and bread with good crust, and a small pot of preserves the colour of dark garnets. Eleanor sat in the high-backed chair beside the fire and ate alone. The fire had been laid by someone before she rose, a small kindness from a pair of hands she had not seen. The house spoke around her in its own language, a timber settling somewhere deep in the wall, the wind pressing at a shutter, a door at the far end of some unreachable passage that swung on its hinge and swung back. She began, in a slow and methodical way, to learn it. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be hurried, only accumulated. She did not stay in her room all morning. That was not in her nature. She wrapped her shawl close and walked the east passage quietly, touching nothing, noting everything. A morning room with its chairs under holland covers, cold and smelling of camphor. A landing where the chill hung motionless as standing water. A turn onto a narrower stair. A corridor longer than she had expected, lit by one small window at its far end. At the end of it she pressed open a door and found herself in a gallery. The curtains had been drawn across every window but one, and through that single gap a pale strip of January light fell the length of the room and stopped against a portrait on the far wall. The woman in the portrait was young. Dark hair simply arranged, a pale gown in the high-waisted style of perhaps a decade prior, one hand resting open on a small leather volume. She had been painted with great care, particularly about the eyes. They held not sadness exactly, but a clear and unfinished expectation, as though she had been interrupted mid-thought, and the artist had caught her in the moment of suspension. Eleanor stood before her and did not look away. She studied the brushwork, the careful attention given to the hands, the quality of light falling on the pale gown. There was no placard below the frame. There was no need for one. The late betrothed, the one whose absence had made this house into something that breathed but did not speak. She heard a step in the gallery behind her and turned. Mrs. Hale stood in the doorway, hands folded, expression composed in the way Eleanor was beginning to learn, not warm, not cold, but steady, like a lamp placed carefully out of the wind. There was a quality to her stillness that suggested she had stood in this particular silence many times before. "His lordship keeps this wing closed in winter, my lady," the housekeeper said. She said it without reproach, without apology, simply as one states a household fact. Eleanor did not move from where she stood. She looked at the portrait once more, at the hands, at the unfinished expectation in the painted eyes. Then she turned to Mrs. Hale. "How long has it been?" she asked quietly. "Since the bereavement?" A pause, measured and unhurried. 3 years, my lady." Mrs. Hale's voice did not waver. "He prefers the house quiet. He will find his way in time." She folded her hands a little closer. The pause that followed was not empty. It held something deliberate in it, something Mrs. Hale had decided apparently to offer. "As will you, I think." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then she nodded once and did not reply. She followed the housekeeper back along the gallery and through the connecting door, which latched behind them with a small sound, like a breath released. The wing fell quiet again. The portrait was left in the cold with its one strip of pale light, and perhaps that was all it required. Eleanor walked back along the east corridor, continuing her mapping of the house, patient and unhurried, learning the weight of each silence as one must when the silence belongs to someone else. The dining room held its breath at 6 o'clock. 2 candelabras burned at the far ends of a mahogany table built for 20, and the space between them was a kind of argument. Empty chairs on either side, silver laid with quiet correctness, crystal catching the flame as though the room itself were trying. Eleanor took her place at the foot. Lord Ashworth took his at the head. They were separated by 14 feet of polished wood, and, she suspected, something considerably harder to measure. He came in without greeting her. He sat. He lifted his napkin and smoothed it across his knee with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste feeling on ceremony. Then he looked at her. Not long. Just enough to satisfy an obligation. She met his eyes steadily, and he glanced away first. "I trust your journey from Norfolk was not too arduous," he said. His voice was even, pleasant even, in the manner of a man reciting something he had prepared in advance. She set down her wine-glass. It was cold, but the roads were passable. He nodded. He asked after her father's health, whether the baronet was well settled at Vane House for the winter months, whether the journey had taken 2 days or 3. The questions arrived in order, like entries in a ledger, and she understood that this was how he had decided to manage the evening, by filling it with inquiry until it was over. A man discharging an obligation, no more and no less. Eleanor answered each question without embellishment. Her father was well enough, thank you. The journey had taken 2 days, with a night at Huntingdon. The roads north of Peterborough had been frozen, but navigable. She offered no flourishes, no quiet sighs to invite his sympathy, no downward glance designed to suggest she was suffering more than she let on. She simply answered what he asked, and then she let the silence settle, and she did not appear to mind it. Ashworth watched her. He had expected, she thought, something quite different. A young wife delivered by financial necessity to a cold house and a colder husband might have been forgiven for weeping or for a particular kind of brittle brightness that amounted to the same thing. He had perhaps prepared himself for that, for the management of feeling, and she had given him none to manage. Her composure was its own kind of statement, and she could see, in the slight stilling of his movements, that he did not quite know what to do with it. He reached for his wine. He set it down again, without drinking. She turned her attention to the soup. It was good. Mrs. Hale had seen to that at least. He spoke again after a longer pause, and this time the prepared manner had left him slightly. His voice was the same, but something in the rhythm of it was different, more considered, more careful. "I keep my mornings for the study," he said. "I have done so for some years. I manage the estate correspondence and accounts before noon, and I prefer to work without interruption." He paused. "I do not intend that as a slight. I simply wish to be clear about the arrangement of the days so that you are not inconvenienced." He used that word, inconvenienced, as though the matter in question were a question of schedules and nothing more. As though Eleanor might be inconvenienced by finding him at breakfast rather than the other way round. She looked at him. He did not look away. "I understand, my lord," she said. "I am not accustomed to being entertained in the mornings. I expect I shall find things to occupy me." He gave a brief nod, lifted his glass. Then he put it down again, and what came next was not rehearsed at all. "I do not mean to be unkind," he said. "I simply have no—" He stopped. The sentence did not come. He looked at the window, at the dark beyond it, and it seemed for a moment as though he might say more, or might retreat from it entirely. She did not rush him. She did not fill the gap. "You need not explain, my lord," she said quietly. "I have plenty to occupy me." He glanced back at her then. It was not a long look, but it was the first one, she thought, that was not obligatory. There was something in it she could not yet name. She returned to her wine. The fire in the side grate settled with a soft collapse of ash, and the room continued in its silent, candle-lit way, as it had done, she supposed, long before either of them arrived in it. He did not leave the table when the meal was finished. He remained a while in his chair with his glass turned toward the fire, and she looked at her hands and listened to the house settle around them, and neither of them spoke again. But neither of them went. She found it on the fourth morning, a door in the passage behind the kitchen, half hidden by a stack of pine log crates, swollen shut from damp and left forgotten through the winter. Eleanor pressed her shoulder to the wood, and it gave with the sound of something released. The still room was small. Cold light fell through a single high window, whose glass was crusted with lime. Dried lavender hung in bunches from an iron hook, the colour long gone and the scent replaced by must. Old glass jars clouded with disuse, a copper still green at the seam. The whole room smelled of mildew over something that had once been sweetness, the ghost of a working house that had quietly given up working. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she went back upstairs for a broom. Over 3 mornings she swept the shelves bare and wiped them down with a cloth wrung in vinegar. She sorted what was salvageable from what was past saving, wrapped the ruined herbs in paper, and carried the lime-crusted jars to the scullery to be scalded. The copper still she left for the tinker, a note clipped to it in her careful hand asking for an estimate by the end of January. She made an inventory on a sheet of paper folded into quarters, what the room had held and what it would need to be of use again. Rosemary, sweet marjoram, comfrey for poultices, a new cord for the drying frame. It was not a large list, but it was a beginning. On the third morning, she walked out to find the head gardener. Briggs was a weathered man of 60 or thereabouts who had grown accustomed, she understood, to making his own decisions in the walled garden, because no one above stairs had shown any interest for 3 years running. He had the hands of a man who worked them daily and the manner of a man who had learned to keep his own counsel. He met her at the garden gate with the careful look of a person who did not yet know whether she was trouble or help. "The south beds," she said, without preamble. "What grew there last season?" He told her. "Nothing of use, only rank grass from neglect." "A waste of good soil," he said, and seemed relieved to say it. She asked what he thought might take in poor winter soil along the south wall, and he answered with the slow precision of a man who had been waiting to be asked. By the time the gate bell rang for luncheon, he had told her about a clary sage strain his wife had kept, and she had told him about the comfrey she intended to establish. Something had shifted between them that was closer to partnership than deference. That afternoon she wrote to Lord Ashworth. The note was brief and formal, as every exchange between them had been. She requested the use of the stillroom for the preparation of household simples, and requested further that the kitchen garden accounts be submitted to her each quarter day, alongside the household bills. She signed it in full, Eleanor Lady Ashworth. She had not yet grown easy with the name, but she wrote it firmly. His reply came the following morning, a single line in his own hand, on unmarked paper. "As you please." She kept the note. She folded it once and placed it in the drawer of the small writing table in the blue room. She was not certain why. It was not a warm reply. It was 4 words, and one of them was a pronoun. But he had written it himself. He had not sent it through the steward. In the economy of this marriage, that seemed worth preserving. There was, she thought, a kind of grammar to this arrangement. Small words, small gestures, the space between them quietly charged with what had not yet been said. Mrs. Hale found her in the still-room the following day, standing on a low step to reach the highest shelf with a cloth still wet from the scullery. The housekeeper stopped in the doorway. Her face was careful, but her surprise was plain. "My lady," she said, "the late Countess never came below stairs." Eleanor stepped down from the step. She set the cloth over the edge of the shelf and turned to face Mrs. Hale. She kept her voice gentle. "I'm not the late Countess," she said. It was not a challenge. She did not mean it to be. The housekeeper heard it clearly, Eleanor thought, because her face shifted, not into disapproval, but into something closer to relief, as though a weight she had not known she was carrying had been quietly set down. "No, my lady," Mrs. Hale said, "you are not." She left without further ceremony, but she paused at the door and mentioned over her shoulder that there was a parcel of dried chamomile in the cellar below the still-room if Eleanor wanted it, saved from the last season anyone had thought to save anything. Eleanor said she would look. She stood alone for a moment in the cold room, the smell of vinegar and old stone around her, and something that felt very much like purpose, and she was glad she had kept the note. The mare began limping some time after 10 o'clock. The stable boy discovered it, a foreleg, swollen at the fetlock, warm to the touch. He left a lantern burning in the loose box and went to fetch help, and the lantern swung there in the dark, throwing gold arcs across the straw. Eleanor heard the mare's restless shifting through the floor above. She lay awake already, as she often did, listening to Ashwell Park settle and sigh around her. The sleet had started an hour ago. It ticked at the windows and rattled the iron drain pipe outside her room, and the sound was not unpleasant, only lonely. She rose without lighting her candle at first. Then she thought better of it. The passage below stairs smelled of cooling tallow and stone. She pulled her wool cloak tight. It was the grey one, plain but heavy, bought the year before her father's affairs became impossible, and she moved through the kitchen passage and out into the stable yard. The sleet was thin and sharp. It stung her cheek and turned the lantern light blurry. She found the loose box by the swinging glow. She heard him before she saw him. Ashworth was already there, crouched low at the mare's near foreleg, both hands on the swollen joint. He had come in his shirt and waistcoat, without a coat, and his sleeves were pushed back past the wrist. The mare was called Asta, a grey with a wide brow and a temper she showed in her ears, and tonight her ears were low, which meant she hurt. Eleanor stopped in the doorway. She had expected to be alone. She had expected a problem to solve in the quiet way she was learning to solve things here, steadily, without announcement, with her hands. She had not expected him. He did not look up. He said nothing, and so she did not speak either. She stepped over the threshold and hung her candle on the hook beside his lantern, and the loose box filled with doubled light. The horse liniment was on the shelf above the water bucket. She found it without searching. She had been in the stables twice already that week, learning where things were kept, the way she had learned the stillroom and the larder and the linen cupboard. Ashwell Park was large. She was making it smaller, one room at a time. She knelt on the other side of the leg from Ashworth. The straw was cold through her cloak. The smell of hay and liniment was thick and particular, the smell of working stables, the smell of her girlhood in a more modest form. Her father had kept 2 horses in the final years, a bay cob and an old chestnut mare past racing. When the grooms were let go, Eleanor and her sister had done the currying themselves early in the mornings before the neighbours could see. She began to work the liniment into the lower leg. She used her palms the way she had been taught, not too hard, reading the joint through her hands. The mare shifted her weight. Eleanor spoke to her, low and steady, the kind of voice that is more sound than meaning. Ashworth watched her for a moment, then he returned to his own work. They were this way for some time. The sleet ticked outside, a rafter creaked above them, the lantern swung once and was still. Neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not the cold silence of the dinner table, the silence that had pressed down on Eleanor for weeks like a stone. This silence was different. It had the quality of shared attention. It was the silence of 2 people doing a thing together. He reached across without looking up and held out a folded cloth. She took it without comment. She had not asked for it. He had not offered it, not in the way of offering, not with words or ceremony. He had simply known she would need it and passed it, and she had simply taken it. It was the most natural exchange they had yet had in 6 weeks of marriage, and neither of them remarked upon it, because to remark upon it would have been to make it strange. After a time, Ashworth sat back on his heels. He studied the leg with a quiet, considered look, the look of a man who had done this many times and trusted his own reading. He said, "She'll do." Eleanor nodded. She ran her thumb once more across the joint and said, "Yes, she has good bone." He looked at her then, not sharply, simply with a new attention. "You know horses?" "My father kept two." She did not pause. She did not make the words smaller than they were. "We curried them ourselves toward the end." He absorbed this. He said, "I see." That was all. It was enough. Two words that carried in them, if she was hearing correctly, something that was not quite apology and not quite recognition, but lived between the two. She did not know what to do with such a thing, so she did nothing with it at all, only went on working. They stood. Eleanor untied her candle from the hook. The mare stood quiet now, her weight even, her ears no longer flat. The sleet had softened to something less than sleet, and outside the stable yard, the night had gone grey at its edges. Ashworth snuffed the lantern. They walked back across the yard without speaking, a yard apart, and the house received them both, cold and still, and a fraction less indifferent than it had been an hour before. The library at Ashwell Park held its quiet differently from the rest of the house. Elsewhere, the quiet was absence, closed doors, rooms no one entered, the particular cold of spaces where no fire was ever laid. Here, in the long room facing west, the quiet was accumulated. Leather bindings breathed. Beeswax from the panelling hung low in the air. Pale afternoon light fell through tall windows and lay in strips across the turkey rug, slow as snowfall. The hearth, though unlit in the mornings, was swept clean and carried the ghost of warmth by the time the afternoon came properly on. It was, Eleanor had decided, the most honest room in the house. Eleanor had found the room in her second week. She had not asked permission, she had simply arrived, selected the chair nearest the western window, a wing-back covered in faded green wool, worn smooth on the arms, and opened the book she had carried from the blue room. No one had appeared to inform her otherwise. The chair had become hers in the way that things become one's own in a quiet house, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of afternoons. She came each day between 2 o'clock and 4. She sat in the green chair. She read. It was the simplest portion of her days at Ashwell Park, and therefore she had come to understand the most necessary. The library did not ask her to be useful. The library did not require her to justify her presence. It merely held her, which was, in its way, more than most rooms had ever done. She had stopped apologizing for the time she spent there. She had stopped apologizing for a great many things. The habit, once shed, was difficult to mourn. On a Thursday in late January, the light thin and silver, the grounds outside stiff with frost, she came to her chair and found something had been left upon it. A folio, large, bound in calfskin the colour of old honey, its cover worn soft with age. She picked it up carefully. It had been left open, the pages held flat by a small, smooth river stone placed at each corner. The prints were botanical, careful, painstaking illustrations of herbs, rosemary with its narrow leaves annotated in brown ink, sweet marjoram, feverfew, the very herbs she had been restoring to the stillroom beds. Whoever had left the folio had opened it, precisely, to the pages that spoke to her work. She sat for a long time. She turned each page with the slow attention the illustrations deserved. There was no note, no name, no explanation offered. But she knew. She had not imagined that he noticed her work in the still-room. She had not imagined he had been watching the walled garden at all. She had assumed she moved through Ashwell Park like a shadow, present, harmless, and largely unseen. She had been wrong on all 3 counts, and the understanding settled into her chest, quietly, with something very close to warmth. She carried the folio home to the Blue Room that evening and did not return it immediately. She read it by candlelight, all 147 plates, turning them in order, and reading the annotations in their careful copper plate. On the Friday, she pressed a single stem of dried rose between the pages. One she had kept from the kitchen passage, still carrying colour, and laid it at the section devoted to the garden roses. She returned the folio to the green chair the following morning, open at the roses, no note. She had none to give that her silence did not already contain. It was 3 days before he came to find her. She was at her chair, reading, when she heard his footfall at the library door, deliberate, unhurried, and yet not quite the step of a man simply passing through. He entered. He looked briefly at the folio lying on the low table beside her, open still at the rose plates. The pressed stem was visible between the pages. "The folio was my mother's," he said. "She grew those herbs." His voice was careful, the way it was careful when he was not certain of his footing. "She had the still-room in good order when she was living." Eleanor looked up at him. "She had excellent taste," she said. She meant the herbs, and the illustrations, and the care with which someone had once learned their names. She meant, perhaps, something further still, that to cultivate a thing gently was a form of understanding she recognized. "Yes," he said quietly, "she did." He did not move to leave at once. He stood by the table and looked at the plate of roses, at the pressed stem she had placed there. And his expression was the expression of a man encountering something he had not expected to encounter. Something that did not hurt in the way he had become accustomed to things hurting. Then he drew a breath, and the set of his shoulders changed very slightly, and he moved to the chair on the opposite side of the hearth. He sat. He said nothing further. Neither did she. The fire was not yet lit, but the room had grown in some small and unmistakable way warmer than before. The drawing-room fire had been built too high. Someone had stacked the grate with coal until the heat pressed outward from the hearth and sat in the corners of the room like an unwanted guest. Eleanor stood near the window, the cold glass pressed at her back, the scorching air pressed at her front. The room could not quite decide what kind of hospitality it was offering. Lady Strathmore's perfume arrived before the lady herself. French, very costly, the kind purchased in Paris before the wars and carefully rationed since. It entered the doorway a full breath ahead of its owner and announced, without words, that the occupant of this house was to be evaluated. The woman who followed was small and very upright, charcoal silk, Brussels lace at the cuffs and at the throat, precisely placed, grey eyes that had learned to assess things without appearing to look directly at them. A china cup was placed into her hand before she had fully settled into the wing-backed chair nearest the fire. She held it the way one holds a verdict, not yet spoken aloud, in 2 fingers, lightly, with perfect sureness of its weight. Eleanor had been told only that an old acquaintance of the family wished to pay a call. She had dressed carefully, choosing her best afternoon gown, The dark green wool, she had altered herself in those first solitary weeks at Ashwell Park, shortening the hem by 1/2 inch, adding a collar of plain ivory. She had thought it respectable. She understood now, watching Lady Strathmore's gaze travel from her hem to her collar, and return quietly to the fire without comment, that respectable was not the measure by which she had been expected to arrive. The visit had begun, in truth, without the formality of introduction. Lady Strathmore had looked at Eleanor once, as one looks at a new piece of furniture that has replaced a piece one knew, and then she had turned to Ashworth and begun to speak. Ashworth sat in the second good chair, a cup untouched on the table at his elbow, his face arranged in the particular careful blankness that Eleanor had come to recognise as his most defended posture. "You have settled in, I see," Lady Strathmore said at last. She did not say it to Eleanor directly. She said it in Eleanor's general direction, in the way one mentions a weather condition, present, acknowledged, nothing to be done about it. "Ashwell Park has always required someone with a steady hand," she continued. She paused. "Charlotte had that. She could manage a household of 40 before she was 20. She said it with the gentle authority of someone who considers the observation generous. She had a natural feeling for a place. She understood what was owed to it. Eleanor set her cup carefully onto its saucer. She did not look at Ashworth. Charlotte's name had the quality of a card laid on a table, not concealed, not flourished, simply placed to see what came back. Lady Strathmore placed it 3 more times in the following quarter hour. Charlotte's taste in the spring flower arrangements, which had made the hall look like something from a painting. Charlotte's way with the tenant farmers, winning the respect of every man on the estate before she was 19. The blue room, Eleanor's own room, had been Charlotte's particular undertaking. The shade of its walls chosen from a bolt of silk she had selected herself during a visit Lady Strathmore remembered quite clearly in the spring of 1820, 2 years before the fever took her in the late winter of 1822. She mentioned this with a small sigh, as though the fever were a piece of carelessness on Charlotte's part. Ashworth said nothing. He reached for his cup and set it back without drinking from it. He studied the fire as though it required his full attention. Eleanor watched, from the very edge of her vision, for anything from him, a redirecting word, a sentence placed between her and the next mention of Charlotte's name. The heat of the room had grown oppressive. She had not noticed it so sharply before. She had not known until this particular moment how much she had begun to hope. The hope had lived quietly in small things. A folio of botanical prints left open at her chair, a cloth handed across a stable floor, a note, 2 words in his own hand. She had not named the hope even to herself because it was fragile and she was cautious with fragile things. Now she named it, precisely because the naming coincided with its damage. His silence settled on her like cold water, and she understood that silence is never quite neutral. She breathed steadily through it. "I suppose you find the house very grand after your circumstances before?" Lady Strathmore said. Her tone was not unkind. That was almost worse. She meant it as a form of generosity. A baronet's second daughter, a modest enough beginning. Eleanor looked at her directly for the first time since the call had started. "I find the house very quiet, Lady Strathmore," she said. "I have been learning to be grateful for that." There was a pause, precise and small, no longer than 2 heartbeats. Across the room Ashworth set down his cup, not with force, not with any declaration in it. He simply placed the cup in its saucer with great deliberateness, as though he were deciding something very carefully, and then he looked, not at Lady Strathmore, and not at the fire. He looked at Eleanor. The drawing-room held its breath, and the fire burned rather too brightly. The sick-room smell arrived before the fever had a name, hot linen and vinegar and the particular stillness of a house that had sent half its people to bed. It came on a Tuesday. A kitchen-maid first, then the second footman, then the under-parlour-maid, within the space of a single afternoon. By Wednesday the scullery was silent, and the corridors of Ashwell Park moved through their work at half their usual pace, as though the house itself had grown heavy-eyed, and could not properly wake. Eleanor knew fever. She had nursed her younger sister through one in the autumn of 1815, in a draughty house where the physician charged 5 guineas a visit and was called only twice. She had learned, in those weeks, to work with what she had, willow bark and vinegar and a steady hand at midnight. She did not wait to be asked. On the first night, she sat with the kitchen maid herself. The candle burned low. She changed the vinegar cloths when they warmed and kept a careful tally of who had been given willow bark and at what hour. She did not ring for the physician until she was certain enough to justify the ride into Hatton village, and she sent a note rather than a footman. She could not spare one. By the second morning she had drawn up a rotation. The women who were well took the day hours, she took the night. It was a practical arrangement, not a sacrifice, or so she told herself. The truth was quieter than that. She did not wish to sit in her room and wait while the house suffered around her. Mrs. Hale found her in the passage at 7:15 with a list of linen requirements. She looked at it, then at Eleanor. "The late Countess," she began. Eleanor shook her head once. She understood what Mrs. Hale did not say. Charlotte would not have known where the linen press was kept. The accounts were a separate matter. The butcher's order was due on Thursday. The coal merchant had sent a query that wanted an answer before the week was out. The household ledger sat in the morning room, and Eleanor went to it each afternoon in the hour she had between the night watch and the evening nursing. She entered her figures without flourish. She did not bring this to Ashworth. She left no note beside his study door. The house ran because she ran it, and she did not require acknowledgment for what seemed to her merely necessary. She was not certain he had noticed that the house was still running. It was possible he had not noticed the fever at all. He had been at his desk since before dawn, each day of that week. She knew it because she passed his study on the way to and from the sick rooms, and the lamplight under his door was the first thing she saw when the house was otherwise dark. On the third night, she was in the small passage off the upper corridor, refolding the vinegar cloths by the light of a single candle, when she heard a step behind her. She did not turn immediately. She was tired enough that the small acts required her full attention. "You should sleep." His voice came from the doorway, low, quite near, not unkind. "So should you, my lord." She smoothed a cloth across the basin's edge without looking up. "You have been at your account since 5. A pause. She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. "How do you know that?" She glanced back then. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not displeasure, not the sealed neutrality she had grown accustomed to reading across a dinner table. Something else, something that had not quite learned its own name yet. "Your lamp is the first light in the house each morning," she said. "I pass your study 12 times a day, or near enough." He said nothing at once. The candle between them did not flicker. The house was very quiet, that particular quiet of a place holding still around those who were sleeping off their illness. "The physician's account," he said finally. "I found it on the morning room desk. I left it for your signature. I could not sign it myself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the passage and lifted one of the folded cloths and set it on the correct side of the basin without being shown how. She did not remark on it, he did not explain. They worked in the near dark without speaking, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of distance. She set down the last cloth. She said good night and took the candle and went back to her watch. And in the cold quiet of that upper corridor, she thought she understood something she had not known when she came to Ashwell Park. That the house had been watching them both all this while, and it had been patient. The storm came an hour before it was expected. By 4 o'clock, the sleet was thick against the glass. It ran in grey sheets down the windows. The fire in the south drawing-room pulled sideways in the draught. The wind was reaching under the eaves to find it. Outside, the elms disappeared into white. The lawns went next. The lane beyond the iron gate swallowed entirely. By 5 o'clock, the sky had darkened past dusk. It was only February, and yet the light was completely gone. The candles on the mantelpiece flinched with each gust, casting restless shadows across the plasterwork. Ashwell Park had always been a house of particular stillness. Tonight, it moved. A door shifted somewhere on its latch. A curtain breathed at its rod. A roof beam settled deeper into the cold, as if the house itself were drawing its shoulders in. The house had known storms before. It had stood 200 years, but Eleanor, who had lived inside it for 4 months, felt its unease as if it were her own. Eleanor had been at her account since 3:30. She had heard the stable clock at each quarter hour without meaning to. It was a habit she had not noticed herself forming until this afternoon. The numbers on the page before her had not changed in some time. She was not reading them. Lord Ashworth had ridden out at 3. She knew this because Jenkins, the head groom, had come to the kitchen passage at 2:45 about the saddle rolls. She had heard the exchange through the still-room door. She had heard Ashworth's voice as well, passing on his way to the yard. "The Morley farm," he had said. "I shall be back before dark." The Morley farm was 3 miles by the lower road. Eleanor did not know that road well, but she had learned in her months at Ashwell Park that it ran along the valley bottom. It crossed a stone bridge no wider than a cart. She had seen it on the estate map pinned in the study passage, a narrow pencil line set close beside a creek, drawn in blue. After an hour of rain like this, that creek would not be a pencil line. She set down her pen at 5:30. She did not pick it up again. She crossed to the window instead and watched the lane. There was no lantern at the gate. There was nothing but dark. She counted what she knew. 3 miles the lower road, a February flood. She counted what she did not know, how long the ford had been impassable, whether he had found shelter at the farm, whether the ridge path was clear. She had been in this house 4 months, and she did not yet know the ridge path. She understood, quite steadily, that she needed to go. Mrs. Hale came in at 5:45 with the coal scuttle. She said nothing. The housekeeper's silences had their own grammar, and Eleanor had spent enough months learning to read them. The woman moved with careful steadiness, attending to the fire, touching nothing unnecessary. Eleanor watched her without appearing to. The clock on the landing rang 6. The sound came down through the floor, muffled by the storm, smaller than it should have been. The kitchen passage had gone quiet, the hall had gone quiet. Even the wind had dropped to a lower register, not calmer but purposeful, the way a long frost was purposeful, patient in its work. Eleanor moved to the window. The glass was black. She pressed her fingers flat against it and felt the cold come through at once, immediate and certain. She had not realized until this moment how quietly she had come to dread the thought of Ashwell Park without him in it. She went to the hall cupboard herself and took out the storm lantern. It was a heavy brass thing, built for weather, a thick glass belly and a leather-wrapped handle that had been worn smooth by decades of use. She lit it at the kitchen fire, cupping the flame against the draught from the outer door. Thomas, one of the younger footmen, appeared at the top of the kitchen steps. He was perhaps 19. He stared at the lantern, and then at her face. "My lady." "Light a second lantern," she said, "and bring it to the gate. Tie it to the post, high enough to be seen from the lane." She paused. "There ought to be a light to ride toward." He moved without argument. She had come to rely on that. She put on her heavy grey cloak, the one that had been her mother's, brought in the smaller trunk, unfashionable and warm. She crossed the stable yard with the lantern swinging at her side. The sleet hit her hood in small hard taps. Jenkins came out of the stable block carrying a lantern of his own. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. "My lady," he said, "the road." "Tell me the roads," she said. He told her. His breath made clouds in the sleet. 3 miles by the lower road, my lady, but that road floods. He would have taken the ridge path. There is a way round up over Harrow Ridge. If he saw the ford, he would have doubled back. She considered this. The sleet struck the lantern glass with a sound like scattered seed. Then he has been on the ridge in this for 2 hours. Jenkins said nothing. His silence had the weight of a man whose knowledge was grim and whose loyalty did not know which way to turn. Eleanor did not ask permission. She asked for the bay mare instead, the one with the good bone, the one they had tended together in the loose box one January evening that now felt like a different country. Jenkins brought the mare without argument. He checked the girth himself, then stood aside. She took the lantern and the reins. She went. The gate swung shut behind her, and the storm received her without comment, the way a long, cold night receives all those who enter it, steadily and without surprise. The ridge path had no mercy in it that night. Black mud swallowed Eleanor's boots at each step, and the wind came off the high moor in long, cold gusts that made the lantern shudder and flatten its light against the glass. Gorse clawed at her hem. The dark was absolute between the lightning flashes, and she counted her steps between them, because counting was the only thing that kept her from thinking too carefully about what she was doing. She heard the horse before she saw it, a low, fractured breathing, somewhere ahead in the dark. Then the lantern found it, the grey, standing motionless at the very edge of the path, reins trailing in the mud, head dropped nearly to his knees, not injured, frightened still. She understood the distinction. A lightning horse was a different animal from a lame one, and she had ridden enough of her father's rough-tempered Irish ponies to know what such stillness meant. The animal was holding itself very carefully together. So was she. He was on the far side of the horse, and she did not see him at first. She spoke to the grey in a low, unbroken murmur, just noise, the kind of sound that carries warmth instead of meaning, and moved carefully around the animal's hind quarters with a lantern angled low. Then the light found him. Lord Ashworth was half sitting, half pinned against the broken remnant of a gate-post, one shoulder held at an angle that told her everything she needed to know before he had spoken a single word. A length of rotted oak, 3 feet at least, had caught him in the fall and come to rest across both legs. He was very still, and watching her. "You should not have come," he said. His voice was entirely steady. That fact steadied her too. "No," Eleanor said. She pressed the lantern into the mud where it would not tip and moved to the horse's head. The grey startled once a small sideways flinch and then accepted her hand at the bridle. She held it there and breathed. "I came anyway," she said. There was a silence with the wind running through it. "Why?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She was running her hand down the horse's neck, coaxing the shudder from the animal's chest, waiting for the moment the breath slowed. "Because you are my husband," she said at last, and there was a light needed on the ridge. She did not look at him when she said it. She was already calculating. The post was heavy, but not fixed. It had snagged on the iron of the gate hinge on one side and caught on frozen ground on the other. If she could work the grey around to pull at the right angle at the right moment, she moved the animal into position without speaking. Small pressures at the bit and the shoulder, the way she had learned to manage creatures stronger than herself. 3 months at Ashwell Park had confirmed what she already knew. A thing done quietly and without announcement was worth more than a thing done loudly. The horse resisted once. She waited, then asked again with a firmer hand, and the grey stepped obediently back. The post shifted, then cleared. Ashworth drew a sharp breath as the weight lifted from his legs, and Eleanor allowed herself to register the sound, and then to set it aside. There would be time for the physician. There would be time for the full account of it, how the lightning had struck the old oak not 20 yards from the path, how the horse had shied before there was any correcting it, how he had fallen against the post with the whole weight of the saddle behind him. All of that could wait. What was needed now was simpler. She needed to get him home. He could stand, which was more than she had let herself hope. His right shoulder was wrong. She could see it, and did not say so. And he winced in a tight, controlled way when he tested his weight, but his legs bore him, which was what mattered. She brought the grey alongside the slope of the bank, where the ground gave him a natural step, and she held the animal steady while he got his good arm over the saddle and found his seat. He did not ask for help. She did not offer it in words. She simply kept the horse still until he was settled. She took the bridle and walked 3/4 of a mile by the ridge path in the dark, with one hand on the lantern and one at the grey's jaw. The wind had begun to ease, not disappear, but thin enough that the lantern held its flame. The mud was unrelenting, but she did not hurry. Hurrying would unsettle the horse, and an unsettled horse was not safe on a ridge path in the dark. So she kept her pace even and her voice low, and said nothing much. She had found over 3 months that silence could be a form of steadiness if you chose it, rather than suffered it. She counted steps again. It helped. They came to the place where the path dipped back toward the lower field, and then the lights of Ashwell Park appeared through the trees. A dozen windows, warm and bright. The stable lantern moving at the yard gate, which meant Mrs. Hale had sent someone. Of course she had. He spoke her name, not my lady, not the formal address she had heard since the wedding morning. He said, Eleanor, quietly and without preamble, and the word arrived in the dark between them with a weight she had not been expecting. She stopped walking for just a moment, though she did not turn around. She let the word stand in the air. She had not heard it from him before, not once in 3 months. "We are nearly there," she said at last. It was not the answer to what he had said. She knew that. But it was what the night required, and she was beginning to understand the difference between what could be spoken on a muddy ridge path with the cold coming off the moor, and what needed a room and warmth, and 2 people with enough time between them to mean what they said. The horse walked on, and Eleanor did not let go of the bridle. The physician's coat hung over the chair by the door. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed when she entered on the second morning, that Dr. Fenwick had remained through the night, and that someone had at last built a proper fire in this room. The hearth was enormous and cold-looking even now that it blazed, as though warmth had been a stranger here for very long. She stood a moment in the doorway and let it settle over her like news. Ashworth lay against the bolsters, shoulder-bound in linen, a cup of willow-bark tea cooling on the nightstand beside the tallowed candle. He did not speak when she entered. He watched her cross the room in a way that felt different from before, not the watchful reserve of a man wishing himself elsewhere, but something slower and less guarded. She chose not to remark on it. She drew the chair a careful distance from the bed and opened the daily accounts. He was confined for the full week, and the physician was firm on that point. Eleanor came each morning at 9 with her stack of correspondence, the steward's queries, the kitchen ledger, 3 letters from tenants, and always the brief notes she had prepared herself. She read them in order. The steward had questions about the south fencing. The Morley farm had sent a card of thanks. The kitchen garden was buried under 6 inches of snow, but would come through it. She reported all of this in a measured voice and did not linger. She kept her posture deliberately easy, and her voice untroubled, as though none of this required special management from either of them. On the 3rd morning, he interrupted her. "What do you think should be done about the south fence?" he said. She looked up. "I think it ought to wait until spring. The ground is too hard now, and the men would work badly in the cold." "Yes," he said, "that is also what I think." It was a very small thing, but she noticed it. The question had not been courtesy. He had wanted her answer. She filed the observation away without making anything of it, but she did not forget it. After that, the exchange shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. He began to ask, rather than merely receive. What did she make of the Morley situation? Had the upper kitchen garden ever produced angelica in quantity, or only in a bad season? She answered him plainly, and without softening her opinions. He listened, and did not correct her, and once, on the 4th morning, when she told him the housekeeper had renegotiated the soap contract at 2 shillings less per gross, he laughed, quietly and very briefly, as though he had not expected it of himself. She turned to the next item on her list and said nothing, which was, she thought, exactly the right thing. The fourth day was a grey Sunday. Sleet came at the windows in long, soft rushes, and the fire had burned down to a comfortable glow. She brought his letters, but also, on an impulse she did not closely examine, the botanical folio from the library, carrying it up tucked under her arm as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She set it on the counterpane beside him, open to the kitchen garden page. He was quiet for a moment, looking at it. Then he said nothing and shifted to make room. She sat on the edge of the chair nearest the bed, and they looked at it together, the folio open between them. She turned the pages slowly, pointing to the herbs she had already ordered for the south beds, the thyme, the rosemary, the border of lavender she had planned along the path. He asked about the angelica again. She explained what it required, the deep soil and the shade and the patience. The fire settled once in its grate. Outside, the sleet moved across the windows in long, quiet sighs, like something exhaling at last. It was the closest they had yet sat. Close enough that she was aware of the careful stillness with which he held his bound shoulder, and the faint weight of him beside her, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a man who has stopped keeping a wall up. She had grown used to feeling held at careful distance. This was different. He spoke near the end of the afternoon. "I was wrong in how I treated you," he said. "From the beginning." She kept her eyes on the folio. "You were grieving." "That is not an excuse." "No," she said, "but it is an explanation." He was quiet, then lower. "I wasted months." She closed the folio gently and set it on the nightstand and looked at him. His eyes were steady and undeflected. There was no performance in them. Only a man who had arrived at something honestly and was not flinching from it. "The house is still here," she said. "So am I." It was not forgiveness exactly, because he had not asked for it, and she was not a woman who offered what was not yet due. But it was true, and it was enough for now, and the fire burned between them in a room that had been cold for 3 long years. The kitchen garden at Ashwell Park had kept its word. Eleanor had placed the order in January, thyme and rosemary, chamomile root, a paper of lavender seed from the seedsman in Bath, on nothing more than faith and a letter written before she was certain of anything at all. She had not been sure in January that she would still be here to see them grow. Now, in the first week of March, snowdrops stood against the south wall in a pale and quiet row, and the narrow bed beneath the kitchen passage window showed the first green tips of the herbs she had ordered, pressing through the dark soil without apology. They were not much to look at yet, but they were there. Ashworth came to the garden for the first time on a Thursday morning. His left arm was still in its sling. The physician had been firm about another fortnight, but he had refused the house another day. Eleanor did not remark on this. She simply made room along the gravel path and showed him the beds in the order she had planned them. He listened without interruption. She had grown used to the silences of this house, but this one was different. He was not silent from want of interest. He was silent in the manner of a man committing something to memory, carefully, because he did not intend to lose it. She found she was content to have him hear it all. She showed him where the lavender would go when April made the ground ready. She described what the head gardener had said about the drainage at the east wall, and the trouble with the light in the far corner, and the roses she hoped to train along the south stone by midsummer. He asked one careful question about the roses. It was not the question of a man performing politeness. It was the question of a man who intended to be present when those roses bloomed and wanted to understand the arrangement before then. Mrs. Hale watched from the scullery window. She did not announce herself. She stood there a moment only, hands quiet at her sides, and looked at what the long months had made of two people who had begun as strangers in this house. Something settled in her expression that had not been settled before. Then she turned away. There was broth on the range that wanted attention and the good linen to check before the afternoon. She was not a woman who lingered over what did not need her. On the path near the south wall, Ashworth stopped. He reached down with his good hand and drew a single snowdrop from the grass at the stone's base, careful to keep the stem. He held it a moment, looking at it in the pale March light. Then he tucked it into the buttonhole of his coat, a small and deliberate thing, and fell into step beside Eleanor. Not half a pace behind her, as he had walked in those first cold weeks. Not ahead. Beside, precisely, as though that had always been the arrangement between them, and the previous months had simply been a delay in arriving at it. They continued to the end of the path without speaking. The morning was pale and soft, the kind that came when winter had finally ceased its argument with the world, and the air smelled of wet earth and something faintly green beginning beneath it. "Ashwell Park looks different from here," he said. Eleanor considered the south wall, the snowdrops, the rosemary tips coming up against the cold. "It looks warmer," she said. "It is warmer." He was quiet a moment. A rook called somewhere past the kitchen yard, then was still. "I would very much like you to stay, Eleanor. Not as a guest in the blue room, as—" She did not let him finish, not to spare him, but because she already knew the words. She had known them since the lantern on the ridge. "Yes," she said. The snowdrop in his buttonhole stirred very slightly in the morning air. Ashwell Park said nothing. It simply stood, as it had always stood, and for the first time in a long while it did not feel like winter inside its walls.